This is the multiple award-winning GardenDC Podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine. Our content is aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 231 of the GardenDC Podcast. In this episode, we talk with Ron Alexander, president of R. Alexander Associates, Inc., all about biosolids. The plant profile is on Jerusalem artichoke, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events in the What's New segment. We close out with the last word on blossoms in the Big Apple from Christy Page of Green Prints. This episode, we're joined by Ron Alexander, president of R. Alexander Associates, Inc., an environmental consulting company specializing in product and market development for organic recycled products. Welcome, Ron.
Thanks, Kathy. Happy to be here.
Great to have you on. And that was a mouthful talking about your company, and we'll get into all of that. And we'll be talking mostly about biosolids, what they are, how gardeners can use them, maybe some precautions around them. But before we dive into all of that, Ron, we like to ask our guests here at the GardenDC Podcast, were they born with chlorophyll in their veins and a green thumb?
Well, I'll say this, that I'm a horticulturist by training, went to school for that. So I've studied a lot. I will honestly say my wife has a better green thumb than I do. But, as a kid growing up in Philadelphia, I mowed lawns and I had vegetable gardens. And I worked for landscapers before I went off and got educated by it. But we're pretty avid gardeners. The homes we've owned, the landscapes have been much better than they were when we got there.
Excellent. So we will tell listeners a little bit about where you are currently gardening. So you were, I think, born and raised in the Philadelphia area, correct?
Yes, go Eagles.
And then, so you said you have a degree in horticulture. What brought you then to North Carolina?
Yeah, so interestingly, I grew up in Philadelphia, and the high school I went to actually had a vocational agriculture, a horticultural program with the greenhouse and everything. So I kind of fell in love with horticulture there, and then went off to a historic agricultural school, Delaware Valley University it is now named. But I got involved in gardening and landscaping through probably what I learned in high school, and starting my own businesses, taking care of people's lawns. But interestingly, when I was in college studying horticulture, I did crazy research taking organic waste and looking at turning them into products and using them in agriculture. And that was way back in the early 80s, really before commercial composting and all that. And so it's kind of funny how crazy research that I did in school led me down this path of really trying to taking these things that were once called waste materials and turn them into more valuable and usable products, both in landscaping and agriculture and even garden sales. And yeah, it's been a really interesting ride. And the interesting aspect about it to me is I've always approached the use of these materials scientifically, not the fact that they're these cool recycled products, but if you're inventing a new product, it has to compete technically with what's being used in the field, and you got to show people the stuff really works. And in our case, the stuff is safe also.
Yeah, and that's going to be some of what we explore in this episode. And I will say, you were saying it's interesting that you were exploring that on an early stage, Things come full circle. There's a
Mhm.
cycle of life, and that's really what we're talking about here. So let's talk first, before we jump into biosolids, about your current garden and your growing conditions. I think you're in the Raleigh, North Carolina area, and we've had several previous guests also in that region. But if you could maybe give our listeners a little bit about that and the soil conditions there.
Sure. I mean, we're in the 8A hardiness zone. Although this winter has been a little bit harsher than usual. Typically, we
Mm-hmm.
don't have overly harsh winters. We do have periods of low rainfall or drought. And one of the other things we get here is what we love to call gully washing rainstorms. We really can get hit with heavy rain, which can cause chaos to gardens, frankly. And one of the reasons it causes chaos down here is because we have these incredibly dense clay soils. And historically, Native Americans used the soil to make pots. And then there's a historical brick manufacturing industry here. So we have these dense soils. So to landscape and garden down here, you are constantly working to improve soil structure and adding organic matter to the soil just to improve the tilth of the soil and make it workable. And
Mm-hmm.
after you kind of get enough organic matter in the ground to allow some water movement, the soils are quite good because they hold nutrients. But yeah, the biggest issues down here are really dense soils and then sometimes crazy rainstorms, which can, we can get, we can get an inch rainstorm easily within an hour, and wash stuff away. So
Yeah, I think those clay soils are very common throughout the mid-Atlantic and the southeastern United States. If you're in the Piedmont zone, of course, or
yep,
if you're in the coastal plain, you have the opposite, which is very sandy soils, which doesn't hold nutrients very well, but also needs lots of soil amendments.
totally. Just for the
Mhm.
opposing reason, to hold water and to hold nutrients, right? And where we add these materials into the dense soils actually to add pore space because they're already good at holding water and holding nutrients. I will say that this is one of the concerns with a changing climate. North Carolina's, we can have hurricanes to the east coast where the sandy soils are, but the big concern longer term is this inland flooding coming from strange rain events because we have these really dense soils that don't perk.
Mhm. Mhm. Yep. So, yeah, as weather events are becoming more intense and frequent, that's definitely a concern for not just gardeners, but everyone. Hmm.
Totally.
So, let's turn to the topic of the episode, biosolids. And first, let's define what a biosolid is, and then let's get into the history of their use.
Sure. Well, I used to joke with people that it's a sexier term for sewage sludge, but that's only half the story, really. Biosolids was a term that was created by the Water Environment Federation, but eh, really what the term reflects is the fact that in this country we have gone through painstaking efforts through the Clean Water Act, actually going back to the 70s and 80s, to reduce contamination levels, heavy metals in the wastewater stream from residential households and industrial locations. And we've done a brilliant job at doing that. So the term biosolids really reflects secondarily treated sewage, which is basically has a lower pathogen content. And pretty much across the country, we've significantly lowered the contamination level when it comes to metals, which was done through pretreatment programs. So biosolids are basically secondarily treated sludge. Sometimes say to people that biosolids is not your grandpop, your grandmom, and your granddad's sewage sludge. The industry has cleaned itself up dramatically to allow land application and use of the material on agricultural ground first. Now, if I can just add one other thing to that is um, there was a series of the EPA really dove into the risk of using these types of materials and what it would take to make it safe to use it. And they promulgated federal law in 1993, and it was called the 40 CFR 503 rules, which is a bunch of mumbo jumbo. We call it the clean sludge law as an acronym or a slang. But really, the cool part about it is it created something called Class A sludge. And that is really what the biosolids are. And these Class A sludges have been secondarily treated, lower again in metals and pathogens, and they can be transformed. They're so clean, they can be transformed into products that can be used by the general public.
Interesting.
Yeah, I sometimes say that it's the greatest story never told in recycling because it makes people squeamish dealing with biosolids. But what we've been able to do in this country is really, really impressive when it comes to cleaning up that waste stream.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, we're all producing it. It has to go somewhere. But the reality of it is most people, out of sight, out of mind. They don't want to think about it. But throughout human history, haven't we, since ancient times, people been using some form of biosolid, not that the cleaned up version say, but what we also call humanure or human manure?
Yeah, I mean, I think that term is not used. There have been books written with that title on it in the US. We don't see that term used as much in the commercial world and in commercial distribution of products, I should say. But let's face it, the Chinese had extensively used human waste as a fertilizer, night soil, and the practices are still used in rural areas of the world. Not something that we do a lot in the US. I mean, the key aspect here is there is a biology, there are pathogens in these materials, and the rural areas that have used this material for a millennia, they have those pathogens in their gut. And so they can use these materials and not get sick from using them. If we tried to use something, people would likely get sick of it because our bodies aren't prepared for that material. Our stuff goes off to a wastewater treatment facility, and it's processed quite heavily before it's reused.
Interesting. So for the humanure movement, the new one versus the ancient one, I believe they are advocating composting it first and then using it for fertilizer purposes as animal feed or fuel. And I think in similar uses to ancient times. I don't know if they were composting it in ancient time or using it fresh, but it's interesting.
Well, yeah, back in China, they were using it. It was being used raw. But again, not a typical scenario in the U.S. nowadays.
No. Yeah, not in modern times. And again, as you point out, our gut biome, not used to that right now.
Totally.
But biosolids are now being used at the industrial farming level, correct? And are they considered organic, additive to the soil, do you know, for organic certification?
Oh, yeah. Great question. So the materials are generated at wastewater treatment plants, and they're sometimes injected into the soil in a liquid form. And very often they use a technique of what they call dewatering. And really what it is just using a certain mechanical technique to remove water where the mass of biosolids is maybe, 20 to 35% solids. So it's kind of a muck, a paste. And that material is often land spread and then incorporated into the soil for organic matter and nutrients. Typically, these materials are applied into the soil or on the soil and then turned in quickly because they can have some odor. And then also there's in these types of materials that go to farms, there can be ammonia, a decent amount of ammonia associated with it. So if you incorporate it quickly, you conserve the ammonia and reduce the nutrients that you need to apply afterwards. So it doesn't go up and volatilize into the sky. As far as organics, So as many of your viewers probably know, your listeners probably know, that there's something called the National Organic Program, and that's a federal law also that created it, and it governs the rules around growing food, quote unquote, organically, and then it also certifies or lists input materials that can be used in quote unquote organic gardening. So Biosolids is exclusively written out of that legislation. You cannot use biosolids. You cannot get them listed as organic, and they cannot be used on organic farms. What we do see happening today is farmers who are pushing for more sustainable practices. They're not going organic, but they're trying to reduce chemical inputs like pesticides and fertilizers. They're using biosolids to help build the organic matter content and the microbial content of the soil. But that would be kind of more sustainable farming, I think, would be the typical term they would use.
Mm-hmm. But they can't get the official organic certification.
No.
Interesting. So, of course, if they used, say, a cow manure that was aged and clean and recycled, or chicken manure, they could get that.
Yes, that's right. Right. Manure-based products can be quote unquote organically certified, or the products created from them listed as organic and used, and they often are.
Yep. Yeah. You'll often see that mixed in, or it will be just used as you said, a slurry or a sludge. I've seen farmers out there with that kind of hose from a tank doing that application that you described with cow manure and other things.
Yep. And then that's one extreme. And the other extreme is they could compost it like we do biosolids, or they could pelletize or granulate the material like we do with certain biosolids. So the whole gambit.
Yep. And at the home gardener level that most of us are familiar with, we can go to any local garden center, farm supply store, even order online bags of chicken manure, bags of aged cow manure, pelletized, as you said, and other forms. So those are readily available to the home gardener.
Totally.
And is Biosolid considered a fertilizer or a soil amendment? How is it categorized, and what are the benefits of using it?
Right. Well, the answer is yes. It can be categorized as a fertilizer or a soil amendment, kind of depending on the nutrient content of it and its form. A good example would be, okay, we take dewatered biosolids. We take 1 part of it by volume and mix 2 or 3 parts of wood chips, and we compost that material. It may take 3-4 months to make a high quality product. We screen it, and that product is typically sold as a soil amendment. Okay, even though it has nutrient content, we're typically not making nutrient claims to make it a legal fertilizer. So the real legal difference in the U.S. of soil amendment versus fertilizer is kind of nutrient content and making a legal labeling claim. Okay, so if we took that same biosolids and we dewatered it, and then we dried it to over 95% dry, and we use the term pelletized, but it's really prilled or granulated, so it goes through a spreader more easily. Those materials, because the water has been pulled out of it, they have a higher concentration of nitrogen, maybe, well, anywhere between 3 and 7% of nitrogen. And that material would almost always be registered and labeled as a fertilizer.
I think that's a great point, Ron. I think there's a lot of miscommunication or misunderstanding about those two terms, fertilizer or soil amendment, because I think anything could be a soil amendment, really. I mean, you could go out and sprinkle some baby powder. That's a soil amendment. Not that you'd want to. But so fertilizer is much more tightly regulated and has to be legally certified, correct?
In most states, both products now have to be registered, believe it or not. And you have to, when it comes to soil amendments, you have to be able to guarantee some type of benefit. So that way, that's a key aspect to the soil. There's something called the Uniform Soil Amendment Bill, and it basically keeps people who are trying to sell snake oil as soil amendments. So you have to be able to prove certain types of benefits. And let's face it, most of the soil amendments we're talking about, whether it's manure or biosolids, we're talking providing a good percentage of organic matter to the soil, improving water holding capacity, providing carbon to feed beneficial microbes. And of course, especially with things like biosolids, we improve the cation exchange or the nutrient holding ability of the soil, which is a big deal.
And let's talk about some of those nutrient profiles for biosolids. So you mentioned nitrogen specifically, that especially at concentrated, dehydrated levels, it's high in nitrogen. But what else is there in the nutrient profile?
Right. There's a moderate amount of phosphorus, or P2O5. Could be as high as 2, 3, 4%. Typically, it's not over 2 or 3%. And there's actually very little potassium or potash in biosolids, where things like hog manure or chicken litter manure or chicken litter would be higher in potash, but we don't have a lot of potash in ours. And the other interesting thing about biosolids is very often an iron-based compound is used to help dewatering. So aside from the nitrogen, which is in very, very slow release form in these materials, providing the green color to plants, also it very often carries a significant amount of iron, which also helps greening in plants. So people will use these materials. Back in the day, they used to use milorganite, that bagged fertilizer. It's been around for literally almost 100 years. It's been sold. The golf courses used it as much because it had 4% iron than the fact it had 7 or 6% nitrogen, and it kept a nice deep green color to the turf.
Interesting. Well, we'll circle back to milorganite in a few minutes, but let's get down to brass tacks, Ron. And I think a lot of listeners, they just want to know, is this safe to use in their home garden?
Yeah. Is it safe to use? Yeah. The easy and general answer is yeah. It's really safe to use. There's always going to be stigma attached to a product like this, but when the EPA and teamed up with the USDA, Department of Ag, to evaluate how do we move towards beneficial reuse, they understood they had to lower the heavy metal content. They did that in almost every facility across the country, and they learned how to manage pathogens. And of course, they constantly study new things that are getting in to the waste stream. But even though some people will never use these types of materials on edible crops, these Class A biosolids products are legal and deemed as safe through a very extensive risk assessment to use on edible gardens, believe it or not. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you're probably eating food that was grown in that.
Well, there's an awful lot of grain that, because they're low value crops, that farmers rely on liquid and dewatered biosolids to add nutrients and organic matter. You will see less fresh vegetables and fresh fruit being grown with the use of biosolids, because there's a greater ick factor, and then there's less processing or heat treatment. So it's, again, just to lower risk. But I can tell you that I've used biosolids products to grow tomatoes. Tomatoes seem to thrive from the stuff. And that's also probably because a lot of it has a decent amount of calcium, which tomatoes need. And tomatoes seem to thrive with it. And yeah, there are a lot greater risks that I deal with than the occasional use of biosolids in a garden.
Garden DC will be back after this short break.
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Groundcover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of the lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf and which plants are the best ones for the job. Groundcover Revolution is here with all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Ground Cover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and Bookshop.org.
Exclusively on ESPN Plus, UFC 313 tonight. Reigning light heavyweight champion Alex Pereira defends his title against #1 contender Magomed Ankalaev, and an explosive lightweight bout between Justin Gaethje and Rafael Fiziev. UFC 313 tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern. Buy it on ESPNPlus.com/PPB.
So on the scheme of things, overall safe, and we'll get into some of those particulars in a minute. But like you were saying, I think if you start off with it in the home garden, using it on your ornamental crops, ornamental things like roses, maybe in your shade garden, also maybe around your tropicals or containers, and not so much in your edibles. That's one way to start off with them. And I've been experimenting using our local Washington, D.C. product, which is called Bloom just like a flower blooms, and that's from our Blue Plains water treatment facility just outside of Washington, D.C. on the river here. Many of us pass it on the road and we're like, what's that giant thing? And so you quickly find out. I will say my own experience with Bloom is I've opened up a bag, I've put my nose really close in there, I cannot smell anything, and I think I have a very sensitive nose. The texture and feel is kind of crumbly, like a lot of compost, kind of earthy. How would you describe it, Ron?
Yeah, they have that product in different forms. The bagged product is somewhat more processed, but they have a version of the material that's a little bit wetter, and that's what's used by the farmers or in commercial topsoil blending operations. But they also, interestingly, I was involved in working with these two products, is they have blends of the material with bark and another one with bark and sand. And they have this wonderful light texture, and they're both primarily used as soil amendments or to build up gardens. And I think that's one of the things that DC Water tried to do. Is there have been good examples of trying to create products out of these materials, but they really have to meet a physical requirement of the end use, you know? It can't be a difficult product to use. So like you said, a lot of these materials are kind of crumbly and don't really have much odor. And a lot of the stuff from DC, from a lot of the Bloom products are sold in bulk and can be purchased through garden centers.
Yep. So we have bulk delivery. And the bag version, I've tend to use it just as a top dressing, again, around roses and other ornamental shrubs. And I was reading up a little on the research, and the Bureau of Land Management says that you should bury it in the soil and or use it in the planting hole, or both. Which way do you recommend to use it, Ron?
Yeah, that's an interesting quote. That quote to me sounds like a quote that has to do with taking a waste material and burying it in the soil to make it safe to, kind of go away.
Mm-hmm.
This material, for kind of all the Class A Biosolids products, including Bloom, they've been secondarily treated. Yeah, they can be blended into the soil. They can be used as components to potting media, and they can absolutely be used on top of the soil. In the 80s, my first company, actually, we used to maintain ball fields by core aerating and top dressing with biosolids compost and then reseeding these fields that were just battered from overuse. And no issues with it at all. Very, very effective.
Interesting. So I do know some tropical plant aficionados and hobbyists who have sworn for decades by Milorganite, particularly that brand, as something that gives a big boost to their tropical plants when it's needed most in the spring, because they put on, huge amount of growth into the summer. And then they found as a side benefit that it actually deters the deer. Have you heard more about that repellent use of biosolids?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I don't know about other animals, but the deer is the one that's been documented, really, really documented. And people will use these materials, and they'll tell people, in a horrible, horrible year when there is no food for the animals, that may not deter them. But apparently there is some type of human smell that the deer pick up, that, they are basically, they're fearful. And it seems to be quite effective in a lot of gardens. And people kind of use it every year for that. Matter of fact, I've worked with some granulated biosolids products that are being used by farmers. And one of the big distribution companies told me that is one of the biggest uses for the product. They're getting a nitrogen or a nutrient boom. They're getting slow release nutrients, but they're one of the biggest reasons they're using it is as a deer repellent.
Yeah, that's so interesting to me that we don't really detect it, but deer have much, much more highly sensitive sense of smells than we do, of course. And I wonder if it also works for rabbits and some other creatures that are related. So I'm going to be
Yep.
experimenting with that a little bit on my own.
I'm unaware of work with other animals. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, it'd be interesting to find out. Do you think that it is an attractant to any animal? And the opposite, say, I know that when people spread blood or bone meal, again for deer deterrent and also as a additive for their soil, that it'll often attract pet dogs. And the dogs will go kind of crazy or roll around in it, which is not a great thing to be doing, especially, if you're familiar with the scent of blood meal, it's not pleasant.
No, and that's a really good one, and I have also found, because having worked with different types of materials over the years, like manure-based materials that were dried and pelletized and were not processed any further. In other words, they were not composted. I would find that our dogs would want to eat that, but they have no interest in the biosolids at all, which I find really, really fascinating. But there's something in there. They're not interested in trying to ingest that.
Good to hear, because dogs, they seem to go for, everything that's not good for them. So
That is true.
when you have the cocoa shells, which they're not supposed to be chewing on, they'll chew on that. They'll chew on some rough bark. So this is good that it's acting both as a deer deterrent, but also not an attractant to dogs. So you did address the heavy metals issue, which I think is a lot of people's concern, especially those of us in urban areas, and we already have enough heavy metals in the soil. Thank you.
Yeah, can I jump in one point with that too? If I can, I apologize. 2 points when it comes to that. Number one is the term heavy metals. It's an interesting term, but the majority of metals that we test for you would find in human vitamins, okay? There are three bad ones. There's arsenic, lead, and cadmium. And they're the ones, all of them you watch for, but they're the ones that are really, really problematic for humans and for animals. But so I do think it's important that there are a lot of things that we use, like zinc and copper and manganese, that are called heavy metals, but they're in the vitamins we take. The other interesting thing is the iron in the Biosolids products has been known to bind things like lead and cadmium in the soil and make them less available to the bloodstream. So they've done work with Baltimore contaminated soils with lead, and they've blended Biosolids compost into it, and they did research, and because of very interesting binding capabilities of these materials, less of the bad metals got absorbed into the rats during the trial. So it's really a crazy whole discussion because it's a very emotional thing. But then when you get right down to it, we're actually using these materials in reclamation projects, believe it or not.
Wow. Yeah, that's really a fascinating research. And, I would love to see more of that being done. And if it can bind up more of the heavy metals, that's another great attribute for using the biosolids, especially in urban areas.
Totally.
So we've addressed the heavy metals concerns and components, and I have some other materials that I've heard from other people they're concerned about, or I have concerns. Of course, our first, when we're talking about this issue, is pathogens, bacteria, or parasites.
Okay, so when it comes to pathogen, there's been great research done with the development of this national research and national standards back in 1993 to look at what it took to knock down pathogens, both bacterial species, but also parasites. And it was pretty well documented that 131 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 55 degrees centigrade, does a great job at killing pathogens. Certain parasites you need about 145 degrees, but there's a firm understanding of that. And then a lot of these products are actually tested for different indicator pathogens to make sure that the levels are so low that they can't be built back up again. So that research was fairly straightforward. And they even had a team that was looking at alternative techniques to complete pathogen knockdown. So that's one of those things that we certainly composting. That's a beauty of composting or granulation and drying. The temperatures are going to just totally take care of the microbes. And it should be mentioned too that both with all of these products, both pathogens and heavy metals are regulated by both the federal government and the state governments. So they're constantly testing for these things. These products are over-tested compared to other lawn and garden products, which probably aren't tested enough, honestly. But that would be it. It's a digression.
I guess. Yeah, I do have some concern sometimes when I'm reading the bags of things, because some things are very clear on the labeling, and I know there's a lot of regulation for some aspects of the industry, but not so much for other aspects. But I think there's some catch up to be done on that labeling and how much a lot of things are marketed, say potting soils versus a fertilizer versus a soil amendment. It's not universal.
No, and yeah, there's always work to be done when it comes to disclosure. But I do think one of the issues holding back some of that is the fact that we are, I do have a scientific background. I'm an agricultural scientist, which I joke that makes me a caveman scientist. I may not be the smartest guy in the world, but we are better and better at testing things and finding things. Our tolerances for going into parts per billion and parts per trillion are even possible. And there's not a good general understanding when it comes to risk. I mean, just about anything bad, contaminant-wise, in this world is in everything around us and the food we eat, sadly. right? But there's a difference between something existing and it being a high enough volume, enough of it to negatively impact risk to whether it's the environment or humans or animals. And that is, so sometimes we see some research that's done that's really bad and it's not realistic to the real world. And it's not helpful. It actually makes people crazy. And there is a need to have smart, risk-based research and discussions around it. But again, it's a scary topic, and you really have to be schooled in it to be able to discuss it. So we kind of ignore it, and then people get really, really paranoid when they hear about something in parts per trillion, you know? So, and I'm not minimizing the fact that there are things we have to do better. Gosh, I mean, absolutely. But, you know, I guess the point is the fact that there is a contaminant there does not mean that it's there in a high enough volume to cause really any risk. And I think that that's, I did work years ago. There was going to be a law written on testing for dioxins in biosolids. This was going to be a law they put in place for the through the EPA. And some of the smaller plants were really concerned about the cost of testing. And they started gathering more and more historical data. And what they found out was the levels of dioxins in the environment and in humans and in people keeps going down linearly, which is fabulous, right? And it's because they passed legislation on improving incinerators, which were the things that were belching out dioxins to the environment. So sometimes, you know, we're down the chain from some of these things, but I think smart data collection and study of these topics is really important, so we can explain risk to people in an understandable way.
I think that's very true, Ron. And as the old adage says, the dose makes the poison. You know, even water can kill us in large amounts, of course.
That's a great saying, by the way. It really is.
And speaking of trace tiny amounts, some listeners might remember some news reports from years ago about every dollar bill in your wallet has some trace of cocaine on it, which brings up pharmaceuticals and testing for those in the biosolids.
Yeah, there's been a pretty aggressive evaluation of what they typically call pharmaceuticals and personal care products and the materials that get into biosolids from that. That about 10 years ago was a great, great concern. And through university research and risk assessments, they basically, the scientific consensus has kind of suggested that it really, the amounts that you see in biosolids really pose no risk to people.
It's great to hear.
However, I will say this: we have to stop dumping pharmaceuticals down the toilet.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a very bad practice.
I mean, it's like what every cop and robbers drug movie or whatever, somebody ditches their pharmaceuticals or drugs into the toilet, which I'm like, well, no, please no.
No, that's right. And the other thing is we have tested, and you know, those types of materials, there's very few and far between that any of them are ever, they're not very easily uptaken by plants. So it would be very hard for them to get into the human system through the use anyway.
Yeah, and I think that's another great point. Maybe something for another episode would be a specialist on how plant root uptake of some of these trace amounts of things that might not be great for humans. Are they taken up into the plant? Do we consume that part of the plant? You know, many of us are familiar with sunflowers being used for soil remediation, and it holds in many of these substances in the sunflower plant, but is it in the seed that we want to eat from that plant? So could maybe follow up on that once research is more available. But I think the last substance I have in my notes here about that people have concerns about are the so-called PFAS.
Yeah, PFAS and PFOA, these very long chain chemicals that have often been used in water repellents. They've been used in pots and pans, a lot used by laundries. And one of the worst materials, believe it or not, is the foam they use to put out fires. Yeah. So these chemicals have been around a long time. Certain ones are now restricted and are not manufactured. So things like PFAS and PFOA, they're restricted in production. And actually the levels in biosolids and other materials is starting to drop, actually. Shouldn't say starting to drop. They're dropping because the two main products, one was outlawed completely, the other one was used in restricted applications. So we're actually seeing numbers of those being dropped. But frankly, it's in everything. It's in our carpets. And the people who can actually run statistical analysis will basically show you that you have a greater chance of absorbing this stuff from your carpets and your personal care products than you would ever get from biosolids or anything like that. My biggest concern is there's a couple things going on with these products. Number one, they are a real concern and they're water soluble. So that makes them potentially a greater environmental risk. We found that there are certain industries like the paper manufacturing industry that uses a lot of this. So the first expose on this came out of the state of Maine, and they found very high inclusion rates, very high doses of PFAS in their biosolids, and they passed a very sweeping law, which in my mind was not a good law. And it was because they tested industrial sludge, not municipal residential biosolids. So most of the PFAS that comes in most of these water treatment plants comes from stuff that was in our houses, okay? There could be a little bit coming from laundromats, but it's these industrial facilities, and the research is now showing us that the treatment facilities that have higher dosages of these materials are the ones that are taking industrial influence. So there's a huge difference between the volume of these substances that can get into the water stream or the wastewater stream, just dependent upon if it's residential versus industrial water. And I'm a firm believer that where this is going to end up, the same way that we had pre-treatment programs that, believe it or not, they figured out ways to determine which industries were putting metals into the water system. And then they passed laws and said, you can no longer do that. You can't have any more than X volume coming out of your facility. And they had to put pre-treatment facilities in. Well, that's going to be the same thing happens with these PFAS products, I think, to limit them. But it is important to note that, the spigot is still running. All of these materials have not been outlawed, and that makes me a little bit crazy. And we have to do better. But again, we do have to look at the risk relationship to these types of materials. But as part of the risk, a lot of things like heavy metals are bound very, very tightly to soil. They don't want to be extracted into plants. They don't want to run off in water. But there could be other types of materials that don't bind like that, and they would have basically a greater risk. So we got to look at them differently.
Yeah, and I'd be interested to hear how that progresses in the next few years. But good to hear that that is not one of the issues for the use of biosolids in gardening or growing.
Yeah, and of course, testing is now ensuing with all these types of materials. So that's a good thing. So we'll have more data.
Great. And so for our listeners, Ron, how can they contact you to find out more?
Well, the best way to contact me is through my website. It's www.alexassoc.net, and I have a pretty extensive library on there on information on the use of composts and biosolids products. And yeah, I think your listeners will have some fun with some of the data.
Great. Thank you so much, Ron.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
In the book The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Teri Speight, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space. No matter what you grow, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? Well, with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills. Wait, did I say job title yet? Get started today and see how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
Jerusalem artichoke plant profile. Jerusalem artichoke, Helianthus tuberosus, also known as sunchokes, are perennial plants grown for their nutritious tubers. Note that it is not a type of artichoke, nor did it originate in the Middle East. In fact, it is a sunflower, and it's native to Central North America. They do best in full sun and are hardy to USDA zones 2 to 9. They grow best in soils of at least average fertility, with very good drainage and a pH that's slightly basic to slightly acidic. The plants need a long growing season to produce a good crop. They do not do well in containers, though, due to their height and the rhizomes and tubers growth patterns. Plant them on a site that is large enough for the sunchokes to become well established and the rhizomes to run. The plants are tall and vigorous. They resemble skinny yellow daisies. The rhizomes can fill a garden patch quickly in one garden season. The rhizomes produce tubers during the last half of summer each year. Sunchokes are most often started by planting small tubers or parts of larger tubers. They can also be started from the small seeds produced by the pretty yellow sunchoke flowers. Sunchoke tubers are low in calories and are a source of several B vitamins as well as iron, magnesium, phosphorus, and potassium. The tubers can be consumed fresh or cooked, and they can be preserved by pickling. They can be prepared in several ways, including baked or boiled. The tubers should be thoroughly scrubbed before preparing them for cooking or consumption. After the flowers fade in early fall, they can be trimmed down to a couple feet tall. Then the harvesting can begin. Harvesting can be done either all at once or one plant at a time, or tubers can be selected and harvested as needed. After harvesting is finished for the season, there will still be a few tubers left in the ground. They will overwinter and sprout for the next spring. Jerusalem artichoke, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, my Tommy crocuses are up, and to me that signals the start of spring is really here. In garden tips that we shared on our social media this past week, we talked all about rose pruning, including the fact that there's no need to seal off the wounds or cuts on the roses or any other trees or shrubs that you might want to prune. Just make sure that the cut is clean, not jagged, and that you sanitize your pruners or other cutting tools between those cuts. And speaking of roses, the Potomac Rose Society is hosting an online talk Sunday, March 16th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and that is Meet the Healthiest Roses in the World and the Breeder Who Creates Them with Cordis Rose Breeder Extraordinaire Thomas Prohl. and this is held via Zoom. You can register for this at PotomacRose.org. It is free and open to non-members, but there are only a few slots left, so I urge you to act fast if you are interested in attending that. And then an in-person talk is taking place Monday, March 17th at Brookside Gardens in Wheaton, Maryland, hosted by the Silver Spring Garden Club. That talk is entitled Maryland's Ferns in the Field and in Your Garden. And the speaker is Kit Sheffield, a past guest on the GardenDC podcast. Doors open at 7. The talk starts at 7:30. Wear your green, and we will celebrate both St. Patrick and St. Gertrude. This talk is free and open to all. You can find out more details about it at silverspringgardenclub.com or at the Silver Spring Garden Club Facebook page. And then the Camellia Society of the Potomac Valley is hosting their spring show and sale on March 29th, also at Brookside Gardens in Wheaton, Maryland. The sale is 9 to 4. The show is 1 to 4. And if you are interested in buying more plants, and who isn't, the 2025 Spring Garden Market at River Farm, presented by the American Horticultural Society, will take place on April 11th and 12th. That's their annual 2-day plant sale and gardening market and fundraiser. The entry fee is $5 per individual or $20 per car. And or if you join the AHS, you get free entry to the sale. More details on that are available at ahsgardening.org/Spring Garden Market 2025. Happy gardening!
This is The Last Word by Christy Page at Green Prints, with Blossoms in the Big Apple, A Green Odyssey by Ellen Siegel. If you had told me I'd ever trade my California haven, complete with fragrant roses and free fruit, for a New York City apartment, I'd have laughed you out of the garden. But life has a funny way of uprooting us, and as retirement beckoned, I found myself transplanting to the concrete jungle. Farewell sprawling gardens, hello cramped quarters and skyscrapers. Gone were the days of vineyard vistas and bountiful harvests. Would I even find a patch of sunlight amidst the shadows of towering buildings? Yet, as I scoured the city for a new home, I discovered a secret garden in every corner. Balconies bloomed with life and rooftops boasted their own green sanctuaries. The city was alive with flora and fauna hidden beneath its bustling facade. Community gardens became my oasis, offering solace amongst the urban chaos. Farmers' markets burst with local bounty, and rooftop hives hummed with the sweet promise of honey. And so, armed with pots and optimism, I joined the ranks of city gardeners. My patio became a tiny Eden where tomatoes thrived alongside herbs and flowers. Amidst the skyscrapers, I found a community of kindred spirits, sharing seeds and stories like old friends. As seasons turned, I marveled at the resilience of life in this concrete jungle. Even in winter's chill, green shoots emerged, heralding the promise of spring. And as a robin danced on my patio, I knew that, like me, the city yearned for the warmth of the sun. In this bustling metropolis, I found not just a new home, but a renewed sense of wonder. For in the heart of the city, amidst the chaos and clamor, life finds a way to bloom. This has been The Last Word by Christy Page at greenprints.com.
Thank you for listening to Garden DC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to the supporter link in our show notes or directly to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com or WashingtonGardener.blogspot.com. You can find Washington Gardener on social media at WDC Gardener on Twitter or X, Instagram, and Pinterest, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. And be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Please take a minute to share us on social media with #GardenDC so other gardeners can find us too.